Imagine standing barefoot on sun-scorched earth, wrists bound in iron, your name already forgotten. The air is thick with dust, sweat, and the cries of the broken. You're one among dozens, no hundreds, lined up beneath the unforgiving sun, your skin blistering, your throat dry, your eyes refusing to cry any longer. Strangers prod your body like cattle. A hand pulls at your jaw to inspect your teeth. Another traces the curve of your hips. There is no shame left, only silence. Not because you accept what's happening, but because the punishment for speaking would be worse. You are not being sold as a servant, nor as a laborer. You are being sold as a woman. And in this place, that means your body will never again belong to you. What does it mean to be sold not just into slavery, but into silence? Not just stripped of freedom, but of dignity, of motherhood, of identity. These are not distant crimes buried in ancient memory. They are the brutal truths carved into the history of African slave markets, truths written in blood, in fire, and in scars that still echo today. For the women of the market, slavery was not a single act. It was a series of punishments, each one more degrading than the last. Public nudity, sexual inspection, ritual humiliation disguised as trade, pain used as branding, and in the shadows, something even darker. But how did such cruelty become normalized? What kind of society allowed women to be stripped of more than just freedom? To understand the inhuman punishments suffered by African women in slave markets, we must first understand the monstrous machine that made them possible, a network of greed, violence, and dehumanization that spanned continents and centuries. Long before European ships darkened the Atlantic horizon, slavery had already woven itself into the economic and political fabric of Africa and the Arab world. The trans-Saharan slave trade trafficked bodies across deserts and into North Africa. The East African coastal trade, spearheaded by Swahili Arab traders, fed the empires of the Islamic world, sending women and girls to harems from Cairo to Baghdad. And later, the Atlantic slave trade would eclipse them all in scale and savagery. But for women, slavery was not just about labor, it was about possession. They were tools, yes, but also trophies. Their value rose not with their strength, but with their fertility, their youth, their beauty. In this warped market logic, African women were both womb and commodity. The systems that enabled this were vast and collaborative. African rulers captured rivals and sold them into bondage. Arab merchants organized caravans and built coastal trading ports. European empires arrived with coin, cannon, and demand. Together, they turned human lives into inventory. To justify the trade, each power twisted belief into law. Some Islamic legal scholars, bending Sharia, allowed the enslavement of infidels as concubines. Christian slavers cited the curse of Ham to justify racial inferiority. African kingdoms saw female captives as economic surplus, not daughters, not wives, not sisters, but revenue. And at the center of it all stood the slave market, not just a place of exchange, but a stage for domination. Here, domination wasn't whispered in chains. It was shouted through rituals, punishments, and public displays that made sure every woman knew her place, beneath the foot of the buyer, the whip of the owner, and the silence of the world. And inside these markets, the real theater of cruelty began. They were lined up before the crowd, not as women, but as wares. Their clothes, if they had any left, were torn away and discarded like rags. Their skin glistened with sweat and fear, eyes cast downward, arms crossed to cover what little modesty they still clung to. But modesty was not permitted in the marketplace. Modesty was stripped first. In the slave markets of Zanzibar, Cairo, Timbuktu, and later in West African ports, the ritual was always the same: the display. Enslaved women were paraded through crowds of merchants, nobles, and opportunists. Buyers would circle like vultures, inspecting every inch. Teeth were checked like horses. Breasts were prodded to gauge fertility. Hips were grabbed, thighs slapped. Some women were forced to squat or bend as men debated the quality of their bodies. Children screamed, men shouted bids, and women stood silent, still shamed. But this humiliation wasn't a side effect of the trade. It was the point. Nudity in these markets was a weapon wielded not just to inspect, but to degrade. It told every woman that she was no longer a person, only flesh. A thing, a body to be bought, bred, or broken. Her dignity wasn't taken in secret, it was auctioned publicly. Historical records confirm the horror. In his writings, Arab traveler Ibn Battuta recounted seeing young girls sold in Cairo, lined up naked before crowds. Portuguese chroniclers described the auctions of West Africa, where the most valuable women, usually the youngest, were shown off like exotic fruit. Some women fainted, some froze, most simply disappeared into themselves, retreating inward as strangers made decisions about their bodies. And the silence was deafening. For enslaved women, even crying could be punished. Resistance meant beating, defiance meant worse. Even girls, barely 8 or 9 years old, were subject to the same ritual. The marketplace made no distinctions. Innocence had no currency. Public humiliation served a second, darker purpose: erasure. By forcing women to stand naked before a leering crowd, the slavers erased identity, erased culture, erased memory. A mother, a daughter, a wife, now nothing more than a number in a ledger. And yet, this was only the beginning. Because even after the sale, the horrors were far from over. The sale was not the end. It was only the beginning of a far more intimate cruelty. Once purchased, the woman became property in the most literal sense, claimed, owned, and marked. Her body was no longer hers. It belonged to the master, and to make sure she and everyone else understood that, they branded her. With a red-hot iron pressed against skin until flesh sizzled, the thigh, the breast, the cheek, each brand bore a symbol, letters, names, emblems of the owner. The pain was excruciating, but the purpose was not just pain, it was permanence, a living certificate of ownership, impossible to erase. In the slave ports of Zanzibar, in the desert outposts of Timbuktu, and along the Nile markets of Cairo, branding was common practice. Arab chroniclers and Portuguese traders alike wrote of this brutal ritual with chilling casualness. It was, to them, a practical necessity, like stamping livestock. But branding was only one form of indoctrination. For women especially, obedience was taught through beating. Slavers believed that pain shaped loyalty, that terror bred submission. Disobedience was met with whips, braided leather soaked in brine to cut deeper. Sometimes the beating was ceremonial, other times spontaneous, a missed chore, a misstep, a moment of hesitation, even silence could provoke it. Imagine this, a mother holding her child for the last time. The child is crying, she clutches him tighter. The master shouts, she doesn't move fast enough. The whip comes down across her back again and again until her arms give out and the baby falls. The child is taken. The mother collapses, not from weakness, but from a pain so complete it reaches the soul. This was not punishment, it was programming. The female body became a battleground of control, cut, burned, beaten into silence. Every scar told a story not of survival, but of domination. Every wound said, "You are mine." And still worse waited in the shadows, because for those women who dared to resist, not just in silence, but in spirit, there was one punishment more terrifying than pain. One that would not just break the body, but take ownership of the womb itself. There were markets within the markets, not for labor, not for fieldwork or domestic service, but for flesh, intimacy, and obedience. These were the concubine markets, where enslaved African women were chosen not for strength, but for softness, for beauty, for submission. Here the transaction was silent and chilling. Buyers would arrive with perfumed handkerchiefs, not shackles. They weren't looking for workers, they were selecting property for pleasure. The women in these spaces were not beaten at first. They were bathed, oiled, and dressed in fine silks, only to be undressed again. Their hair was styled, their bodies inspected more intimately. They were trained to dance, to smile, to serve, not for survival, but for seduction under coercion. This wasn't kindness, it was grooming. Once taken into a harem, whether in Baghdad, Mogadishu, or the palace of a local warlord, a woman's identity dissolved, her name replaced by a number or title, her role reduced to two things, pleasure and procreation. But not all women accepted this silently. Historical records speak of resistance. One girl, barely 17, bit the hand of a buyer during inspection. Her punishment was public and horrifying. She was stripped, bound, and raped before the other captives to set an example. Others were mutilated, nipples sliced, genitals burned, faces disfigured, to render them unfit for resale but useful only for torment. And yet, even this wasn't the cruelest fate. In some regions, enslaved women were sent to breeding farms, hidden compounds where their only purpose was to give birth. They were paired forcibly with male slaves chosen for size and health. Love, consent, and choice were illusions. Their children, once born, were taken, sold, and never seen again. A woman might bear 7, 8, 10 children and never know a single name. On ships crossing the Atlantic, enslaved pregnant women were often forced to give birth in corners of the hold, among urine, vomit, and death. Portuguese slavers recorded births mid-voyage. Some babies were thrown overboard if deemed weak. Others were taken the moment the umbilical cord was cut. There are accounts from Arab slave registers in the 16th century categorizing women based on their reproductive potential: virgins, concubines, breeders. Each label was a sentence, not a status. For these women, even their wombs did not belong to them. They became factories of flesh, producers of the next generation of enslaved bodies. Womanhood was not honored, it was weaponized. They were punished not only for what they did, but for what they were: fertile, female, and utterly defenseless in a world that commodified both. And still, the worst punishments were reserved for those who dared to escape, to disobey, or to defy. Because the final lesson was carved not in pain, but in death, silence, and erasure. For those women who resisted, who fought back, who ran, who refused to submit, the punishment went beyond pain. It crossed into a place few survived, and none escaped whole. Defiance was seen not just as rebellion, but as betrayal. A betrayal of the master's control, a betrayal of the system. And for that, the punishment was designed to do more than hurt, it was designed to erase. Some were mutilated, their ears sliced off to mark them as disobedient, their noses slit open as warnings to others. Their breasts, symbols of femininity and motherhood, were severed, not only to disfigure, but to destroy what made them women in the eyes of their captors. A woman who could not nurse, who could not seduce, was not spared, she was marked. Others faced execution, not in secret, but in public spectacle. They were burned alive before crowds of slaves, hanged in village squares, or drowned with stones tied to their ankles. These punishments were orchestrated to send a clear message: resistance will be remembered only by your corpse. There were no funerals, no grave, no names carved in stone. Their stories were swallowed by silence. In many cases, enslavers performed what they called honor killings. A woman who insulted a buyer, who refused sex, or who defended another slave could be executed by her owner, legally, with no consequence. In some societies, such as parts of the Ottoman-influenced North Africa, these killings were justified through twisted legal doctrines. In Christian-ruled regions, they were simply ignored. And yet, despite every effort to silence them, echoes of these women survived. In the oral traditions of West African griots, old songs speak of daughters taken and never returned, of mothers who vanished, of sisters who were last seen weeping in chains. Their names are gone, but the grief lives on, carried by generations who never knew their bloodlines, only the pain they inherited. Some believed that a woman who died enslaved would never find peace, that her spirit would wander until her story was told. And so they wander still. In modern times, descendants of these women search for traces, for names, for origins, for something, anything to hold. But the records are few, the ledgers are cold, and the silence is vast. But their pain didn't vanish. It wasn't forgotten. It was buried in plain sight beneath the weight of history and the convenience of forgetting. The inhuman punishments inflicted on enslaved African women were not random acts of cruelty. They were part of a system, refined, structured, and designed to strip away not just freedom, but identity, dignity, and voice. These women weren't just enslaved, they were displayed, branded, beaten, violated, mutilated, silenced. And through it all, They were made to endure the one punishment that never ended: erasure. Their stories were buried, not just beneath the soil, but beneath indifference, denial, and time. Their names lost to ledgers, their bodies lost to history, but their pain passed on in whispers, in wounds, in the invisible weight carried by generations, remains. Even now, the scars are not all physical. They exist in cultural memory, in fractured ancestry, in the silence of forgotten bloodlines. They echo in the ongoing violence against Black women, in the struggle for bodily autonomy, in the fear that even today, their suffering will be minimized or ignored. This was more than slavery, it was a war on womanhood. And so we ask, if history forgets the screams of the women in the market, who will remember their names?